Hey, I'm Matt Williamson, and we are going to talk a little bit about the Buffalo Springfield's second album, the Buffalo Springfield Again. This is probably the band's best moment in the studio, and there's a lot of background and some interesting things that go along with this album, and we're going to talk about that here on Pop Goes the 60s. The Buffalo Springfield started in 1967 on a high note. They came out with their biggest hit, For What It's Worth. That hit number 7 in the charts. And they were set to start recording their next album. The next single they were going to release was a song called Mr. Soul by Neil Young. And it was during those sessions that they fired their management team of Green and Stone, who had been producing them. After the debacle of the first album, where Green and Stone clearly were exposed as non-producers, things came to a head in the studio during the Mr. Soul sessions, and those guys were fired. So Mr. Soul, one of the band's best songs, probably would have been released, but things started to go downhill at this point for the Springfield as Bruce Palmer was busted for a second time, this time for marijuana. He was busted back in November, but when they had the managers Green and Stone, those guys could kind of get him off. Now with them being fired, Bruce Palmer had no recourse. He was deported. He was from Canada, and he was here in the States illegally, and he was deported. This stalled the band. So the momentum for the rest of the year would start and stop again with members coming and going. So this album, Buffalo Springfield Again, was not the intended album. The original album, conceived partially by the record company, was going to be called Stampede. And they shot a cover for it, and the guy in the front with his hat over his head is Dickie Davis, their tour manager. Bruce Palmer had been in Canada. He was out of the band at this point, and they were looking for a replacement. So they started recording tracks, but things were slow with the band. They were starting to tour more because of For What It's Worth being a hit, a nationwide hit number 7 on the charts. They could tour outside of Los Angeles and San Francisco. So they were busy touring, and come spring, they got a gig on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Now, the Carson Show was a big deal for the Springfield because of a couple of reasons. Number one, the exposure. But second of all, it was the first time Carson ever had a rock band on his show. And that is according to this book by John Einerson. There's Something Happening Here, the story of Buffalo Springfield. So this is a great book if you want to get the full story on the band. So by this time, Bruce had come back to the band. He snuck into the country illegally, cut his hair shorter, and they were just starting to coalesce again and get together when Neil Young announces he's leaving the band. And this is right before the Carson Show. They're in New York, and they had to cancel the show. So Neil Young left the band because he was going to work. He wanted to be a star himself. He didn't think the band was getting him there, and he hired a guy named Jack Nitzsche to produce him. And Nitzsche was a guy that worked a lot with Phil Spector and had this wall of sound production style down. And Neil Young started working on a couple songs with him, one being Broken Arrow and the other being Expecting to Fly. These were very orchestral songs, very Sgt. Peppery, and it wasn't long before he came back to the group and brought these songs with him to finish.
Expecting to fly. Did you see them in the river? They were there to wave to you.
Now, Stephen Stills, the songs he was working on, the next single ended up being Bluebird. So the single Bluebird and Mr. Soul, it's probably the best representation of the band ever on a record. So you've got, in Bluebird, you've got this wonder Appalachian acoustic bluegrassy fusion with rock, multiple guitars in it. And then Mr. Soul, you've got this hard driving, fuzz-toned, Rolling Stones-ish, very gritty sound.
Things only of you, just you.
Unfortunately, Bluebird as a single only got to number 58. So the band was a little bit disappointed in that, but still they pressed on recording this album. And because Bruce Palmer was gone, he's only on a few of the tracks, so they had a couple other bass players in and out of the band at this point before one of their producers and engineers, Jim Messina, took more of a role in the band. The next single was Rock and Roll Woman. And to me, this might be their best song. Great song. David Crosby assisted with the writing of the song, and he is singing a background on it. But for a 2-minute 44-second piece of music, this is the band at their best.
She's a joy to know.
Now, on the first album, Richie Furay was denied a song on that album. There were a couple written and a couple that got recorded, but they were not on the album. On this record, he makes up for it with a song called Sad Memory, a real slow ballad, and one of his best songs with the band, A Child's Claim to Fame, which has got more of a country flavor.
You became, truth is a shame, too much flame.
So on this record so far, we've got some Appalachian folk, we've got some Rolling Stones type of hard rock, we've got some orchestral Sgt. Pepperish type of stuff. I mentioned some country from Richie Furay. We also have some jazz. The song Every Days is one of Stephen Still's most unusual songs, but it's recorded live in the studio, full band production, and very jazzy.
Away with things of ecstasy, the sound of trees, most any breeze, what a babe.
Surrounding up this album is a song, Dewey Martin even gets a lead vocal, and that's on the song Good Time Boy, which was written by Richie Furay. And that was a song that he used to sing in concert. It was kind of his spotlight. So generally speaking, it's a pretty good mix. All the members are really contributing, despite Bruce's being gone for a part of it, where they had a couple different bass players playing on it. I think it gets critically acclaimed because of its diversity. It can feel a little bit disjointed at times with the different styles and the different players in and out. And they don't all play on every track, but song for song, this is their best album. Now, this album was supposed to release in the spring of '67 under the title of Stampede. This didn't make it out till November. And it charted at number 44, so it was it was much better than their last album, which only charted at number 80. So they're moving at least in the right directions from an album charting standpoint. So as 1967 drew to a close, the band was really having trouble, this time live. Stephen Stills and Neil Young started to try to outdo each other with guitar solos, and Bruce Palmer was getting fed up with this. Dewey Martin kind of described Stephen Stills and Neil Young after one show anyway. They were like two old women hitting each other with their purses. Palmer never really gelled back with the group upon his return. And for all the griping they did about not being able to play without Bruce, when he came back, they couldn't play with him. So things were starting to unravel live. And 1968 would see one more very good album. So we're going to talk about that in another video here on Pop Goes the 60s.